mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper, he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe does seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal.
Welcome to the Defending Faith and Family podcast, where we equip and enable the current and future generations of protectors and providers to stand as bold, mighty men of God in every aspect of life, rooted in Scripture and lived out in faithful homes and communities. Because when men lead well and their wives support well as co-heirs in Christ, families thrive for God's glory. Today, we are jumping into a really profound take on history and civilizations. I want you to imagine just for a second a sort of biological clock, but not in the human body. Think of a clock ticking silently inside every empire, every nation, every human institution. And this clock basically says that your government, your society, no matter how beautifully designed it is guaranteed to rust. It is a relentless, invisible countdown. It is unavoidable. And today we are going to learn how to hear that ticking. We are opening up a stack of historical materials that honestly feels like finding the hidden source code to human history. It is like the architectural blueprint for why things fall apart. We are unpacking an ancient framework that explains the rise and fall of civilizations, and we are going to use it as a lens to understand current events, the absolute structural genius of the American founding fathers, and the unyielding reality of human nature. What makes this so compelling is that we are not starting with modern political science or some recent think tank white paper. We are going back over 2,000 years, back to the Hellenistic period, to a man named Polybius. Normally, when you hear about ancient Greek political theorists, you picture a guy in a toga sitting in a marble courtyard somewhere, completely insulated from the real world, just spinning abstract utopian theories. But Polybius was the exact opposite. He was a man of action, a Greek statesman, and actually a cavalry commander in the Achaean League. He knew combat. But here is the crazy part. In 167 BC, after Rome defeated Macedon, the Romans demanded 1,000 elite Greek hostages just to ensure their loyalty. Polybius was one of them. He was forcibly relocated to Rome, but instead of rotting in a cell somewhere, his intellect got him assigned to the household of one of Rome's most prominent families, the Scipios. He became best friends with Scipio Aemilianus, who was the Roman general who would eventually burn Carthage to the ground. So Polybius literally stood shoulder to shoulder with the men who were actively conquering the known world. He was an eyewitness, standing there watching Greek city-states tear themselves apart while this Roman juggernaut consumed the Mediterranean. And he did not just record the dates and battles like a standard historian. He asked the ultimate diagnostic question, why? Why is Rome surviving and expanding while everyone else is collapsing into total chaos? His answer is found in Book 6 of his masterwork, The Histories. He introduces this concept called Anacyclosis, the core theory we are unpacking today. It is the idea that governments and societies do not undergo random circumstantial shifts based on bad luck or bad weather or an isolated bad leader. Instead, they follow a highly predictable biological life cycle. To Polybius, this cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death in human government is as inevitable as rust on iron. If you leave iron exposed to oxygen and moisture, the chemical reaction is unavoidable. It will rust. And Polybius argues that if you leave a human government to its own devices, it will inevitably decay. There is no escaping the elements. What blew my mind as I put this together is how this ancient Greek political science connects directly to Reformed Christian theology. It maps perfectly, and then you can trace it straight into the constitutional engineering of the United States. It shows exactly why utopian dreams, this idea that we can just build a perfect society on Earth always, without exception, turn into nightmares. Because utopias ignore the rust. It builds a case for why a deeply grounded biblical realism is the only way to construct an institution that actually survives. It is a profound synthesis. But before we actually track the specific stages of this cycle, the Anacyclosis wheel, we have to understand the engine driving it, the heartbeat of the cycle. If governments have a biological life cycle, why does no single system, no matter how brilliantly designed it is at the start, just last forever? On paper, if you come up with a fair set of laws, there is no mathematical reason it should not run perpetually. But Polybius viewed constitutions as living organisms. They are not static machines. They have a birth, a period of vigorous growth, a prime of life, a season of decay, and eventually, a death. So, there is no such thing as eternal upward progress in a pure political system. There is only a relentless return to the starting point. Which brings us to the root cause. If you want to know why the cycle is inevitable, you have to look at the raw material the system is built out of. And that material is human beings. And this is where we draw a brilliant direct line from Polybius's historical observations to the theological framework of the Bible. specifically Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? That is the root. When you pull it out of a personal devotional context and apply it to macropolitics, it explains the rust perfectly. It actually makes me think of mixed martial arts. Think about a fighter's gas tank in the octagon. Imagine a high-level championship fight. In the first round, a fighter's technique might be absolutely flawless. His hands are up, his head movement is crisp, his footwork is perfect. He is fresh. The system is working exactly as designed. But as the fight drags on into the championship rounds, fatigue sets in, and it does not matter how perfect his training camp was. As exhaustion takes over, the hands start to drop, form gets sloppy. Reaction time slows down, and the underlying vulnerabilities, the holes in his game, are completely exposed, and that is when he gets knocked out. In politics, that fatigue, that exhaustion that drops the guard of a nation, is human corruption. It is the deceitful heart. A new government might start out incredibly strong, driven by high ideals, or maybe the shared sacrifice of a revolution. The system is fresh. But as time goes on, as the society settles into a routine, and especially as prosperity sets in, the moral fatigue begins. The inherent selfishness, the subtle greeds, the quiet compromises, the hands start to drop. And eventually, the underlying vulnerability of human depravity is exposed, and the whole system collapses. And this leads right into a concept we have to highlight from the economist Thomas Sowell. He talks about the constrained vision. When you sit down to build a society, or honestly even just lead an organization or lead your family, you essentially have to choose between two fundamentally different views of human nature. Sowell divides social theory into two camps, the unconstrained vision and the constrained vision. The unconstrained vision is basically the utopian view. It assumes that human beings are essentially blank slates, or even fundamentally good. It argues that people only do bad things because of bad environments or poverty. So, the logic is, if we just fix the environment, we fix the human. If we can just invent the perfect economic system, or implement universal education, or put the right panel of highly educated experts in charge, we can actually cure the human condition. We can engineer a society where greed and crime just naturally fade away. But the constrained vision says absolutely not. The constrained vision, which aligns perfectly with both Polybius' history and biblical theology, says that human nature is inherently flawed. It is constrained by original sin, innate self-interest, bias, and moral corruption. You cannot perfect human nature through legislation. Pastor John MacArthur emphasizes this constantly. Apart from regenerating grace, apart from the Holy Spirit changing a man's heart, the unregenerate human heart is going to run the exact same selfish script every single time, regardless of the century or the technology. You cannot eradicate the flaws. You can only build institutions that account for them, channel them, and mitigate the damage. And we really have to address a common misconception here because in our modern culture, we often assume that poverty and desperation are the primary drivers of societal collapse. We think if everyone is just comfortable, things will be fine. We think that if we just make everyone wealthy, society will stabilize. But Polybius observed, and the theological sources firmly agree, that prosperity does not cure human nature. In fact, prosperity often acts as an accelerant to the decay. It is like pouring premium fertilizer on a bed of weeds. When a society is in a struggle for sheer survival, people are forced to cooperate. They have to rely on each other. They have to value competence, and they have to suppress their petty grievances just to make it through the winter or to survive a war. But when survival is no longer a daily question, when wealth and security become the baseline, that external pressure is removed and arrogance takes root. People become obsessed with luxury, status, and perceived slights. The lust for power replaces the desire for mutual preservation. I can see exactly how that scales down too. As fathers, as providers, we often work ourselves to the bone to provide financial prosperity for the next generation. We want our kids to have it better than we did. But if that wealth is not paired with intense character development and grounded biblical virtue, if you just hand a kid a life of absolute ease, it is also the fastest way to ruin their character. It breeds pure entitlement. You have to train them spiritually, not just provide for them materially. So if human nature is this predictable and prosperity accelerates its decay, how does this actually manifest on a political level? This is where we get into the wheel. Polybius maps out his Anacyclosis wheel. He breaks this down into a highly specific sequential cycle of 6 stages, sometimes counted as 7 if we separate the initial state of nature. I want to walk through this wheel step by step because the psychological transitions between these stages are just fascinating. Let's start at the absolute beginning, stage 1 and 2, the journey from primitive monarchy to kingship. How does a civilization even get on the wheel in the first place? Polybius starts with a very realistic premise. He says, society often begins or resets after a massive cataclysm like a natural disaster. Think of a devastating flood, a localized famine, or the violent collapse of a previous empire. You are left with scattered survivors living in absolute terror and chaos. The ultimate reset. And in that pure state of nature, human beings intuitively flock together like herd animals for protection, and out of that frightened herd, a physically dominant alpha emerges. This is someone who simply possesses the raw physical strength, the cunning, and the brutality to fight off wolves, repel rival tribes, and impose a rough sort of order. Polybius calls this primitive monarchy. It is the rule of one, held together entirely by sheer force and fear. It is the law of the jungle. The guy who can swing the biggest club gets to dictate the terms, and people submit to him because the alternative is being killed by scavengers. But you cannot build a real, lasting civilization on just raw fear. So how does that evolve? It evolves through the introduction of reason and sociology. As time passes under the protection of this strong man, the chaos subsides. People start forming family units, building homes, planting crops. Life starts to normalize, and they begin to realize that this strong man is not just a terrifying force. He is actually providing a necessary and deeply valuable good, security. He is the protector, and at the same time, the strong man himself undergoes a psychological shift. He realizes he cannot just fight every battle himself forever. He needs the willing cooperation of the tribe. So he starts to actually govern, not just by swinging the club, but by establishing norms. He arbitrates disputes fairly. He protects the weak from being exploited by the slightly less strong. He demonstrates courage and self-sacrifice. And when this happens, Polybius says primitive monarchy evolves into virtuous kingship. So the foundation of authority completely shifts. It moves from, I obey you because you will crush my skull, to, I obey you because I respect your justice, and I am grateful for your protection. The glue holding society together shifts from fear to moral consent and profound gratitude. The people genuinely love the virtuous king. That sounds like an incredibly stable, happy setup. But we know the wheel does not stop, so we hit stage 3. The pivot into tyranny. The rust starts to show. It almost always comes down to generational transfer. The virtuous king, the man who earned his scars pulling the society out of the apocalyptic ashes, eventually grows old and dies, and the crown passes to his heirs by hereditary right. And there is the metal fatigue we talked about. These sons are born into the palace. They never had to fight off marauders in the freezing rain. They never had to earn the profound respect of the peasants. They just get handed the keys to the kingdom. They inherit the absolute authority, but they do not possess the forged character, the humility, or the virtue that justified that authority in the first place. They lack the trial by fire. So, they look at the wealth of the kingdom and assume it exists solely for their personal consumption. They indulge their physical appetites. They demand luxurious clothing, exotic foods, and absolute compliance. And they start abusing their power, bending the laws to punish anyone who annoys them or threatens their fragile egos. The virtuous kingship rots into tyranny. The psychological whiplash must be intense, because you know your grandfather loved the old king, but now you are being impoverished and humiliated by his spoiled grandson. Polybius notes that this sparks a massive emotional inversion. The deep gratitude that the people felt toward the monarchy turns into a burning, passionate hatred. The court of the tyrant becomes a grotesque theater of flattery, insolence, and lawless excess, while the common people just seethe in resentment. The society is a powder keg. The tyrant is abusing everyone, but a tyrant has an army. The common peasant with a pitchfork is not going to be the one to bring him down. So the revolution is actually spearheaded by the nobles, the high-spirited, educated, prominent men of the society, the guys who have resources. These are the military commanders, the wealthy landowners, the people who have the tactical knowledge and the sheer physical courage to risk their lives against the tyrant's guards. So they organize a coup, they band together, they scheme, and eventually they strike. They assassinate the tyrant, or they raise a rebel army and send him into exile. They liberate the state, and the masses view these guys as absolute saviors. Out of sheer gratitude, they gladly hand the reins of government over to this group of liberators. And this is aristocracy. The word literally translates from Greek as rule by the best. It is a council of wise, experienced, courageous men governing paternalistically for the common good, and it usually works beautifully for the first generation. These men remember the horrors of tyranny, and they take their duty to the republic incredibly seriously, but the aristocrats die off, and their children inherit their seats on the council, unearned authority again. Just like the tyrant's son, these young aristocrats inherit the immense prestige and power of their fathers, but they never had to risk their necks to overthrow a dictator. They have only known privilege. So, the corruption of an aristocracy looks different from a single tyrant. It becomes an oligarchy, which means rule by the few. Instead of one man indulging his appetites, you have a closed class of wealthy families obsessively guarding their status, the elite snobs. They close ranks. They change the laws to ensure that no one outside their bloodlines can ever gain political power. They manipulate the economy to funnel the nation's wealth into their own private estates. They essentially weaponize the system against the working class. They treat the common citizens not as a flock to be protected, but as an underclass to be managed and exploited. So once again, the average citizen is getting crushed. Only this time, instead of suffering under one crazy king, they are suffering under a syndicate of elites. And this brings us to the most fascinating pivot on the wheel. Stages 6 and 7. Democracy falling into autocracy or mob rule. By this point, the populace has learned a bitter historical lesson. They look back and say, we trusted one man, and he became a tyrant. Then, we trusted a group of the best men, and they became greedy oligarchs. So fueled by righteous anger and the sheer weight of their numbers, the oppressed masses rise up. They overwhelm the oligarchs, take their wealth and privileges, and establish a democracy. To Polybius, democracy was not a bad word. It was a beautiful system characterized by freedom of speech, equality before the law, and policies dictated by the majority of the citizens. When you describe it like that, it sounds like the ultimate finish line. It sounds like the Enlightenment dream. Everyone is equal. Everyone votes. Everyone is free. Why does the wheel just not lock into place right here? It is the paradox of success. Polybius argues that democracy functions incredibly well at first. The people who fought and bled to defeat the oligarchs treasure their new equality. They respect the laws because they wrote them, but then the biological clock ticks forward. A new generation is born. These children grow up in a society where freedom and equality are just the default background noise of life. They never tasted the bitter oppression of a tyrant or the financial strangulation of an oligarch. They did not pay the invoice for the freedom, so they do not respect the guardrails that keep it functioning. Because they take equality for granted, the ambitious members of this new generation want to stand out. They want to be preeminent. But in a pure democracy, you cannot seize power by force, and you do not have a noble bloodline to lean on. So how do politicians gain power in a system of pure equality? They have to buy the favor of the masses. They become demagogues. They realize that the fastest way to get votes is not to appeal to the people's virtue, but to their appetites. They start promising handouts from the public treasury. They promise to tax the rich and distribute the spoils. They flatter the crowd, telling them they are victims who deserve more. So they essentially bribe the public with the public's own money. And this introduces a profound moral rot into the populace. Envy spreads like a virus. The people become addicted to the handouts and the flattery. They start believing that they are entitled to everything without having to work for it. And they stop caring about the rule of law. They only care about their own faction's immediate gain. And this is the tipping point into autocracy, which means mob rule. The democracy degrades into raw emotional factionalism. The people, whipped into a frenzy by the demagogues, begin to crave raw power. They institute the rule of violence. They just bypass the courts completely. They plunder the property of their political enemies. They banish or execute anyone who stands in their way. Society devolves into a terrifying state of perfect savagery, driven entirely by the whims of an angry, envious mob. It is the complete exhaustion of the society's virtue. The structural mental fatigue has caused a catastrophic failure. So what happens when you have a society of perfect savages operating under mob rule? There is a breaking point. It is the reset. Out of that absolute chaos, bloodshed, and economic ruin, the average person becomes completely desperate. They do not care about freedom of speech or voting rights anymore. They just want to be able to walk down the street without being murdered by a mob. And in that moment of ultimate desperation, a new strongman steps onto the stage. The alpha returns. He is ruthless. He commands a loyal faction or a military force, and he violently suppresses the mob. He imposes order by the sword, and the people just gladly surrender all their liberties to him just to make the chaos stop. And just like that, the wheel completes its rotation. You are right back at primitive monarchy. I want to steelman the modern optimist's view here, because I know exactly what someone listening to this might be thinking. They are saying, look, this is a neat ancient Greek theory, but Polybius lived in antiquity. They did not have the scientific method. They did not have the Enlightenment, the printing press, the internet, or global supply chains. Surely human progress has altered this equation. Haven't modern education and technology allowed us to outgrow this biological wheel? Haven't we broken the cycle? It is a totally valid question, and honestly, it is exactly what the philosophers of the French Enlightenment thought they were doing. They truly believed that reason and education could cure human nature, but the sources do not agree with that. Modern education and technology do not alter the fundamental architecture of the human heart. We go back to Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful. An educated heart is still a deceitful heart. It just possesses a much more sophisticated vocabulary to justify its selfishness. The internet does not cure factionalism. It just allows the mob to assemble digitally at the speed of light. Technology does not change the software of human nature. It just upgrades the hardware it runs on. As Thomas Sowell and the American founders clearly recognized, human institutions can only channel self-interest. They cannot eradicate it. If you build a constitutional system on the utopian assumption that widespread education or material prosperity will make your citizens perfectly selfless, that system is going to collapse the moment it faces a severe crisis. History proves over and over that the supposed flaws in the optimist's argument are not temporary glitches in progress. They are just the ancient reality of human sin repackaged for a new century. To prove this is not just a philosophical thought experiment, we can actually go on a brutal historical autopsy. Let's walk across 2 millennia to prove the inevitability of this anacyclosis wheel. Let's start with the ancient evidence. How did this play out in Athens? Because Athens is always held up as the shining beacon of ancient politics. Athens is actually the textbook case study of anacyclosis running at full speed. Following the chaos of the Minoan collapse, Athens was ruled by early kings. Over centuries that stabilized, but then slid into a tyranny in the 6th century BC under a man named Pisistratus. And how did he seize power? What is fascinating is he actually used a democratic mob to do it. He intentionally wounded himself and his mules, drove his chariot into the marketplace, and claimed his political enemies had tried to assassinate him. A false flag operation. The sympathetic assembly voted to give him a bodyguard of club-wielding citizens. He then used that very bodyguard to seize the Acropolis and establish himself as tyrant. His sons inherited the tyranny. They became paranoid, abusive, and arrogant. Stage 3. The nobles, highborn leaders, eventually managed to break the tyranny, and they implement sweeping aristocratic reforms. This evolves over a few decades into the famous Athenian democracy under Pericles. This is the golden age we all read about in school. The Parthenon is being built. Philosophy is flourishing. Citizens are voting in the assembly. But the golden age never lasts because Pericles dies and the new generation does not have his restraint. The demagogues arrive, the guys who bribe the crowd. Men like Cleon step up to the podium. Cleon was notorious for whipping the Athenian mob into frenzies of entitlement, anger, and suspicion. He promised them more money from the imperial treasury and told them their military commanders were secretly betraying them. And this leads straight into autocracy, total mob rule. The most disastrous example was the Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War. The mob, drunk on its own perceived invincibility and greedy for plunder, voted to send their entire armada to conquer Sicily, which was a completely unnecessary and strategically insane war. And when things went wrong, they panicked, recalled their best generals, and even executed several of their naval commanders after a victorious battle just because a storm prevented them from rescuing shipwrecked sailors. They executed their own victorious commanders. Because the mob demanded blood, the mob's emotional volatility destroyed the state. It ended in total military collapse, starvation, and eventually they were conquered by the Macedonian monarchy of Philip and Alexander. The wheel makes a full rotation. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, the wheel essentially had a massive continent-wide hard reset. Because you had roving barbarian warbands, the total collapse of economic infrastructure, cities emptying out, absolute lawlessness, and out of that apocalyptic chaos, primitive monarchies naturally arose. You had tribal strong men like Clovis of the Franks, or Theodoric of the Ostrogoths. They did not rule by divine right or complex constitution. They physically dominated the landscape with heavy cavalry and created pockets of order. And then that rough, primitive monarchy eventually evolves into a more virtuous kingship. Charlemagne in the late 8th century is a perfect example of peak virtuous kingship. He was not just a warlord, he was giving laws, patronizing scholars, establishing Christian order, and fiercely protecting the vulnerable from Viking raids. But what happened after Charlemagne died? His heirs break it apart. His grandsons fought over the inheritance, fragmented the empire, and Europe devolved into feudal tyranny. Petty warlords ruling their tiny fiefdoms by arbitrary force and taxation. And we see the exact same sequential spin in England centuries later. You start with the Norman monarchy, William the Conqueror, imposing absolute order after the chaos of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Over time, it stabilizes into the relatively functional Plantagenet kingship. But then, by the early 1200s, it rots into the tyranny of King John. He is excessively taxing the nobles, losing wars, and ignoring justice. So the nobles, the high-spirited men, step in. This is the classic aristocratic check. The barons rebel. They march on the king, and they force King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 at Runnymede. They establish a council of nobles, an oligarchy essentially, to check the king's power. But the wheel keeps spinning. Over the next century, you get democratic stirrings. The power of parliament expands, but it eventually boils over into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. That was pure autocracy. Mobs burning down manors, executing the Archbishop of Canterbury in the streets, demanding an end to all hierarchy. And if you want to see a localized version, look at Florence during the Renaissance. It is like Anacyclosis on fast forward. They went from the Medici oligarchy, these incredibly wealthy merchant bankers running the city behind a facade of republicanism, straight into the theocratic mob rule of the friar Girolamo Savonarola in the 1490s. Savonarola whipped the democratic mob into such a frenzy of moral panic that they were burning priceless art and books in the bonfire of the vanities. And within a few years, the mob turned on him, burned him at the stake, and the city whiplashed right back into tyranny. But if you really want to see Anacyclosis on a terrifying speedrun, look at the 18th century. The French Revolution is the ultimate, undeniable proof of Polybius's theory. You start in the 1780s with the absolute monarchy of the Bourbons, specifically Louis XVI. By this point, the kingship had clearly decayed into a detached, luxurious tyranny. The royal court at Versailles was drowning in opulence, while a series of bad harvests left the common people literally starving in the streets of Paris. Stage 3. The rust is undeniable. It is not the peasants who start the structural revolution. It is the aristocracy phase, the educated bourgeoisie, the lawyers, and the liberal nobles. They form the National Assembly in 1789. They take the tennis court oath. They want to set up a nice, neat, enlightened, constitutional monarchy run by the best men. But they cannot control the momentum. It instantly slides into the democratic phase. They draft the 1791 Constitution, aiming for equality and liberty. But there are no brakes built into the system. The Parisian mob has tasted blood after storming the Bastille, and they realize their sheer numbers can dictate policy. Demagogues step onto the stage men like Maximilien Robespierre. They weaponize the paranoia of the crowd. The democracy plunges straight into the darkest depths of ochlocracy, the reign of terror. Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety bypasses all legal due process. If someone accuses you of not being enthusiastic enough about the revolution, the mob tribunal sends you to the guillotine. Thousands of people are publicly decapitated. It is absolute lawless excess justified entirely in the name of the people. And out of the blood and terror of the guillotine, the psychological reset happens. The people are so exhausted by the constant fear, the collapsing economy, and the paranoia that they do not care about the ideals of liberty anymore. They just want someone to make the madness stop. And who walks onto the stage? Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant, ruthless military strongman. He utilizes the army to clear the politicians out, imposes rigid order, and eventually crowns himself emperor, reinstating absolute monarchy. The wheel completes a full, unimaginably violent rotation from Bourbon king to Napoleonic emperor in less than 15 years. And this is not just ancient history or Enlightenment drama. We see it right up through the 20th century. Look at Weimar Germany. Following the chaos of World War I, the German imperial monarchy collapses. They set up the Weimar Republic, a highly progressive democratic system, but it lacks deep-rooted cultural virtue and structural breaks. When the pressure of hyperinflation hits, it slides into street violence. You have communists and fascist paramilitaries literally battling in the streets. And out of that desperate mob violence, Adolf Hitler emerges as the strong man, promising absolute order, and establishes one of the most brutal tyrannies in human history. The Russian Revolution followed the exact same path. The oppressive tyranny of the Tsars is overthrown by the moderate democratic provisional government in early 1917. But because the institutions are weak, it immediately gets hijacked by Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks, who utilized the mob to seize power, leading directly to the horrific tyranny of the Soviet state under Stalin. What is so chilling here is the sheer predictability of the mechanism. Tracing this predictable mechanism makes me think of a concept in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In Jiu-Jitsu, if you are caught in a terrible bottom position, let's say your opponent has full mount and is just crushing your chest, that is tyranny. It is suffocating, and your natural instinct is absolute panic. You just want out. You are desperate to escape. But if you just explosively bridge and buck, throwing all your energy into wildly escaping without first securing your base and actively controlling your opponent's grips, you might temporarily get out of the mount. But you are going to roll right into a chaotic scramble. Limbs are flying. There is no structure, just raw movement. And because you entered the scramble with no base and no control, you will inevitably leave your neck completely exposed, and the opponent will snatch a rear-naked choke. That chokehold is the new dictator. You enthusiastically escaped one bad position only to blindly throw yourself into a much worse, tighter submission because you lacked structural control. If a society explosively reacts to tyranny without simultaneously securing the structural grips of a civilization, which are the rule of law, the separation of powers, and a deep bedrock of moral virtue, it will inevitably roll right into the chaotic scramble of mob rule and then tap out to a new dictator. So this raises the ultimate question of the cycle. If every pure political system is doomed to fail, if the biological clock always wins, how on earth did Rome manage to steamroll the Mediterranean and outlast all of its rivals? Because Polybius was living in Rome. He saw them surviving and thriving while Greek city-states were spinning out of control. The sources call Rome's solution the Roman hack. Rome found the brake pedal for the wheel of Anacyclosis. And what is crucial to understand is that they did not do it by sitting in a room and drafting a utopian philosophy. They built it through brutal, generational, empirical trial and error. Through centuries of internal class struggle between the patricians and the plebeians, they accidentally forged what Polybius called the mixed constitution, a deliberate structural equilibrium. Instead of having a pure monarchy, or pure aristocracy, or a pure democracy, Rome took the best elements of all three and smashed them together into one government to neutralize the inherent vices of each. Let's break down the mechanics of this, because the sources describe the Roman system as an architecture of mutual fear, which is such a brutally realistic, almost pessimistic way to build a government. But it worked. It is deeply realistic because it assumes the constrained vision of human nature. First, the monarchical element, the consuls. Rome did not have a king. Instead, they elected 2 consuls every year. These men were the supreme commanders of the military and held immense executive power. When they were out in the field commanding the legions, their word was absolute law. But they could not just turn their armies around to become tyrants. They were heavily checked by the aristocratic element, the Roman Senate. The consuls commanded the physical army, but the Senate, which was composed of the wealthy, experienced elders of the society, controlled the treasury and the supply lines. A consul could not wage a long, glorious war if the Senate refused to fund his legions or send him grain. Furthermore, the consuls were checked by the democratic element, the Roman people. If a consul went out and signed a peace treaty with a foreign king, it was completely invalid until the People's Assembly voted to ratify it. And even more terrifying for the consul, when his 1-year term was up, he became a private citizen again, and the people could immediately put him on trial for corruption or military incompetence. So the executive strongman is kept completely in check by the purse strings of the Senate and the threat of severe public accountability from the masses. What about the Senate? How are they kept from turning into a corrupt oligarchy? The Senate managed foreign policy, handled the budget, and controlled the courts. They were the institutional memory of Rome, but they were checked because they could not actually pass laws on their own. They could only propose decrees. The democratic element, the people, had to officially vote to confirm those laws, and more importantly, the people elected specific representatives called tribunes. A tribune of the plebs had a sacred, inviolable status and possessed the ultimate veto power. So, if the Senate was trying to pass a law that crushed the poor, a single tribune could physically stand up in the Senate House, shout, veto, which means, I forbid, and stop the entire machinery of the Roman government dead in its tracks. And the democratic element, the people, how did Rome prevent them from devolving into a mob? The people had massive power. They elected the officials, they passed the laws, and they officially declared war. But they were structurally subordinate to the consuls when it came to the actual execution of those wars and the enforcement of the laws. And they relied entirely on the Senate to manage the incredibly complex daily affairs of the empire. The diplomatic negotiations, the public works. The mob could not just spontaneously vote to execute someone without navigating a labyrinth of procedural checks. It is like military tactics. Specifically, the concept of overlapping fields of fire. If you are a platoon commander setting up a defensive perimeter in a combat zone, you do not just point all your soldiers in one direction. You position your machine guns and riflemen so that their lines of sight intersect and overlap. Because if an enemy advances on one squad's position, they immediately take devastating flanking fire from another squad. In the Roman mixed constitution, no single branch can advance its power, indulge its corruption, or dominate the state without being immediately covered, checked, or hampered by the overlapping fire of the other branches. And Polybius argues that this mutual friction is exactly what made Rome historically unstoppable. In times of extreme external crisis, for example, when Hannibal of Carthage was marching war elephants over the Alps, slaughtering tens of thousands of Roman legionaries at the Battle of Cannae, this mixed system forced the branches to unify. The sheer terror of Hannibal made the people obey the consuls, and the consuls listened to the Senate. But more importantly, in times of peace and prosperity, when arrogance and luxury usually set in and rot a society, the mutual fear and jealousy between the consuls, the Senate, and the people prevented any one group from gaining enough leverage to become tyrannical. The sources offer a brilliant contrast here by looking at Rome's contemporaries, Sparta and Carthage. Sparta actually had a mixed system designed centuries earlier by their legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. But the Spartan system was far too rigid and insular. It was designed for keeping internal stability in a tiny geographic valley while suppressing their slave population, but it was too brittle. It could not scale. The moment Sparta tried to run an overseas empire, their system cracked. Carthage, on the other hand, was Rome's great peer competitor. But Polybius notes that by the time of the Punic Wars, the Carthaginian constitution had already passed its prime and tilted too far into the democratic stage. The masses and the wealthy merchant factions had gained too much sway over the aristocratic Senate, and this led to rampant bribery, intense political factionalism, and terrible short-sighted strategic decisions. Most notably, their failure to properly resupply Hannibal when he was actually on the verge of crushing Rome. Rome succeeded and survived the war because the Roman Senate maintained its aristocratic gravity and resolve during the darkest days of the crisis. Rome's success was not lost on history. The blueprint was preserved. And here is where this gets incredibly relevant and frankly thrilling for us as Americans, and really for anyone living in a modern Western republic. Fast forward from the Roman Republic to the sweltering summer of 1787. The sources frame this historical junction as Polybius meets the Puritans. Because the American founding fathers did not just read Polybius for historical trivia, they used his histories as an engineering manual to build a nation. We have to remember the context of 1787. The founders had just won a grueling revolution against a tyrannical monarchy, King George III. But under the Articles of Confederation, their new nation was falling apart. They knew they needed a stronger central government, but they were absolutely terrified of the Anacyclosis wheel. They were steeped in classical history. They knew that if they set up a pure democracy, it would inevitably slide into mob rule, which would then summon a new dictator. And John Adams was, essentially, the intellectual architect sounding the alarm. While the delegates were gathering in Philadelphia, John Adams was serving as the American ambassador in London, but he was terrified that his countrymen were going to build a flawed, purely democratic system. So he feverishly wrote a massive 3-volume work called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. In this work, Adams heavily quotes Polybius. He explicitly maps out the exact biological cycle of decay we have been discussing. He warns the delegates across the ocean that they must at all costs bake the Polybian brake pedal into the national system. And Adams was not just theorizing, he had already successfully baked this exact tripartite separation of powers into the Massachusetts State Constitution in 1780, which is still the oldest continuously functioning written constitution in the world today. James Madison, who was in Philadelphia and is rightly called the father of the Constitution, was operating on the exact same frequency. In his intense preparations for the convention, Madison meticulously studied the rise and fall of ancient confederacies. Using Polybius as his primary guide to understanding why democracies fail, the sources highlight the Federalist Papers, specifically Federalist 47 and 51, as the absolute core of this philosophical engineering. Let's dig deeply into Federalist 51. Because Madison gives us one of the most famous and most brilliantly cynical quotes in American political history. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That single sentence is the operational hinge of the United States Constitution. He goes on to write a paragraph that perfectly encapsulates the constrained vision. He says it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. The sources describe that phrase as Jeremiah 17:9, translated into Enlightenment prose. Madison is acknowledging the deceitful, desperately sick heart of man, the Puritan realism that was so deeply embedded in the culture of the American colonies. This profound theological awareness of total depravity and original sin meshed perfectly with Polybius's ancient political realism. The founders realized a profound truth. You cannot build a durable system that relies on politicians being selfless, holy, or immune to corruption because they will not be. Human nature guarantees it. So, instead of trying to suppress ambition, you have to build a system that assumes politicians will be overwhelmingly ambitious, greedy, and power-hungry. And then, you mathematically arrange the institutions so that their selfish ambition becomes the very engine that checks the selfish ambition of the other branches. It is political judo using the weight and momentum of human sin against itself. But as robust as the American blueprint is, the founders only bought us time. Polybius warned that even the most perfectly balanced mixed constitutions eventually rust when the underlying virtue of the citizenry drains away. The overlapping fields of fire only work if the soldiers manning the guns have the moral courage and the character to actually hold the line. If everyone agrees to abandon the Constitution to get what they want, the paper it is written on cannot stop them. So, diagnostic time. Where are we on the Anacyclosis wheel today? When political analysts and historians look at modern Western democracies today through the specific lens of Polybius's Anacyclosis, they see significant symptoms of late-stage decay. Specifically, they see our systems tilting heavily toward oligarchy while simultaneously experiencing severe, increasing flashes of autocracy. Analysts point to the massive concentration of wealth and political influence in the hands of corporate and tech elites. You no longer have a system driven purely by the voting citizen. Instead, you have a revolving door political culture. Politicians leave public office and immediately become highly paid lobbyists, consultants, or board members for the massive multinational corporations they use to regulate. The symptom of this oligarchy is elite disconnect. The average citizen looks at the system, looks at the economy, and feels completely alienated from the decision-making process. They sense quite accurately that a small, wealthy, highly insulated class in Washington, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley is actually running the machinery of the state for their own preservation and benefit, totally detached from the consequences their policies inflict on the working class. That is the exact definition of oligarchy we discussed earlier, the corrupted aristocracy pulling up the ladder and managing the peasants. And history dictates what happens next. When the people feel ignored, disenfranchised, and mocked by the oligarchs, they get angry, which brings us to the flashes of autocracy, mob rule, When trust in the institutions collapses, the people revert to raw factionalism. You see it manifesting on the political right with the January 6 Capitol riot, a direct physical clash driven by a deeply held populist belief that the institutional system is completely corrupt and unresponsive. You see it manifesting on the political left with the BLM riots of 2020, widespread street violence, autonomous zones, and the destruction of property driven by a visceral sense of systemic injustice that the courts supposedly will not fix. And you see it constantly in the digital realm with cancel mobs. Crowds use the leverage of social media to completely bypass the judicial system, due process, and the rule of law to destroy people's lives, reputations, and livelihoods based entirely on viral outrage and emotional frenzy. That is pure digital autocracy. And it is not just an American phenomenon. We see this instability globally. The text points to Venezuela as a tragic, rapid, modern example of the cycle. They had vibrant democratic elections that brought Hugo Chavez to power on a wave of populist promises. But that quickly slid into an oligarchic centralized socialist state and has now fully decayed into the brutal, starving tyranny of Nicolás Maduro. You see populist surges across Europe as well, from Brexit in the UK, which was fundamentally a democratic pushback against what the working class viewed as an insulated EU oligarchy in Brussels, to the rise of strongman figures like Orban in Hungary. The core takeaway from the sources regarding our modern moment is this: elite disconnect combined with fractured identity politics proves the ancient rule. Prosperity without character accelerates the rust. When the leaders lack sacrificial virtue, and when the citizens lack self-restraint and a commitment to the rule of law over their own faction's victory, the institutional breaks of the Constitution start to fail. The friction of constant outrage simply burns them out. Which brings us to the profound theological conclusion of this episode today. Because it is incredibly easy to look at this biological wheel of societal decay, to look at the structural metal fatigue in our own republic, turn on the news, and just feel a sense of absolute crushing despair. But we do not end in despair. The text cites prominent theological voices like Vadi Baucham and John Piper to give us the ultimate perspective on anacyclosis. They remind us of the biblical doctrine found in Romans 13. Earthly kingdoms, republics, and governments are merely provisional. They are temporary God-ordained restraints on human evil. They were instituted to maintain basic order, but they were never meant to be our saviors, and they were never designed by God to last forever. We are reminded of Daniel 2:21, which states clearly that it is God alone who changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. The rise and fall of Rome, the violent spinning of the Anacyclosis wheel, the fraying of modern democracies, none of this catches God by surprise. He is entirely sovereign over the biological cycle of nations. We are told in Psalm 1:46-3, "Put not your trust in princes." And that is the ultimate warning against political idolatry. The American founding fathers were brilliant. They used Polybius and their deep Puritan understanding of human depravity to build an absolute masterpiece of political engineering. But they were only men. They only gave us centuries. They could not give us eternity. They built a magnificent dam against the flood of human sin. But every dam eventually develops cracks. Therefore, our ultimate conclusion must be grounded in where our true hope actually lies. While we absolutely have a duty to steward the liberty we have been given to vote wisely, to advocate for justice, to be bold and courageous in our communities, to lead our homes well, our ultimate hope cannot rest in the United States Constitution, the Supreme Court, or any earthly mixed regime. Our hope must rest entirely in Christ's incorruptible kingdom. We look to Isaiah 9:7, which promises that, of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. He is the only perfect, truly virtuous king whose rule will never succumb to metal fatigue and will never decay into tyranny. We are looking for the city whose builder and maker is God, as Hebrews 11:10 says, because that is the only city that will never rust. It completely reorients how we engage with the political chaos today. We engage with sober realism, with courage, and with a commitment to truth, but entirely without the frantic panic of those who think this political world is all there is. Amen. This has been a phenomenal journey through these sources. Unpacking Polybius, the founding fathers, and the theology of human nature gives us such a powerful lens. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on what we have unpacked today. Polybius explicitly noted in his writings that the anacyclosis cycle speeds up rapidly when new generations forget the evils of the past. When a generation forgets what tyranny or mob rule actually feels like, they take the boring stability of freedom for granted and they recklessly invite the mob back in. Today, we live in the information age. We have access to more historical data on the supercomputers in our pockets than any generation in human history. But we are arguably starved of historical wisdom. Between the constant dopamine-driven distraction of social media, the ideological rewriting of history, and our absolute obsession with the 24-hour outrage news cycle, we are suffering from a profound societal digital amnesia. So, The question I leave you with is this: will our unprecedented flood of data actually cause us to forget the vital lessons of the past faster? And as a result, is our digital amnesia going to make the wheel of anacyclosis spin faster than ever before? It is something deeply important to think about as you navigate the news, lead your homes, and shape the next generation. As always, we here at Defending Faith and Family leave you with this exhortation from the Apostle Paul. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Amen. Stand strong in Christ, lead your homes well, and train yourselves both spiritually and physically.
This world with devils filled should threaten to undo us. We will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can